This is a crisis case study evaluating the Vale Brumadinho tailings dam's collapse in Brazil in 2019. This is in support of Griffith University course 7125 LHS. This is an overview of what I'll touch on in this case study. After going through the initial background and the crisis event, I will touch on issue management, particularly looking at Coombs's signal detection and correction theory. I'll then go on to look at some specific issues around framing, issue lifecycle, and media amplification. Finally, I'll bring it all together under the PPR framework and the crisis management theory adapted from JAX. This is just a bit of context on the company, Vale. They're the 5th largest mining company in the world, a multinational with annual revenue in excess of $34 billion US. A couple of key contextual points relating to this disaster. Firstly, mining companies, in particular multinational companies, operate under a social license. This social license is important for their reputational viability in the long term. And as the world becomes more environmentally aware, mining companies have more and more public scrutiny on them and their actions. What you're seeing in the images attached is the aftermath of another mine disaster in 2015. Vale was a co-owner of a mine where the Fundeo tailings dam collapsed in 2015. The resulting mud flow killed 19 people and created significant downstream environmental and social impacts. In their response, Vale swore this would never happen again. Then, in 2019, it happened, and again, they promised people it would never happen again. But this time, the public and the media weren't going to accept it. So on January 25, 2019, the tailings dam at the Brumadinho mine site suffered a catastrophic failure. The video you're watching now is this failure. For those not familiar with mining, tailings is a waste product of the iron ore process. The idea of a tailings dam is it's meant to form a solid mass where you can vegetate and rehabilitate and remove water from the process. This resulting mud flow that you're seeing now inundated the downstream mine as well as the downstream village. There's a few technical issues that come up with this. Firstly, why would you construct a dam upstream? And secondly, if you look at the flow of this particular material, it's obviously flowing way too fast. There's too much water in there, a process called liquefaction, and so there's some technical issues here. This flow then carries on down the mine. You can see a few vehicles here which get caught up in there. And as a result, 270 people died because of this dam failure. Some of them were villages downstream, most of them were on the mine site here. It also caused enormous damage to the downstream environment, as well as destroying towns and people's livelihoods in farming areas. The scale of this disaster was enormous. There were organisational, environmental, management and reputational crises. And while I'm going to focus on the organisational and reputational crises, the broader environmental, political and social impacts from this crisis were massive and are ongoing. Here is a brief overview of the timeline. What I'm going to focus on is the events leading up to the dam failure. As you can see here, there's several internal Vale reports which highlights the risk within the dam. There's also reports from downstream residents indicating potential issues with the dam, and they reported it through to the mine. Not to mention the 2015 disaster, where another dam failed in a very similar way. From an issue management perspective, particularly looking at Coombs's signal detection and correction, you can see here that Vale actually identified a series of issues with this dam, but failed to properly prioritise or act on those issues. I contend that if they had done so, and the technical literature tends to agree, that if Vale had acted when they saw these reports in accordance with good engineering and risk management practices, they could have averted this crisis. In terms of Vale's response, they did have some positives. They had a crisis plan and they activated it immediately. They were quick to communicate with their enabling and functional stakeholders, as well as get out there with the media. And the CEO did show compassion and leadership during their initial response. However, it was later found that this was not completely honest. However, there were many failures in Vale's response. On the day of the crisis, Vale issued a statement referring to the failure as an accident. This was the same approach they used in 2015, and they attempted to frame the issue as a non-fault natural event. However, given the 2015 event, the media and the public weren't going to accept this. It was also later found that Vale withheld information about dam safety during their initial response and addresses to the media and stakeholders. This ultimately undermined their credibility and caused long-term, prolonged reputational damage. As the crisis moved from the initial response into the next phase, Vale also resorted to a legal focus and tried to protect the company from the legal risks it faced. They likely suffered from a legal response syndrome as termed in JACS. However, that in doing so, they traded off other reputational and organisational considerations. Despite the severity of the crisis, it did more or less follow the issue life cycle. What you're seeing here is the role the media has in amplifying the issue. You can see the initial peak after the dam fails, and it does slowly tail away. However, there are sustained media interest in Vale, with peaks and troughs following due to key events such as compensation or criminal activities. What this media amplification did in practice was cause reputational damage to Vale. Media articles around the world caused investors, professional associations, banks, international customers to distance themselves from Vale in order to appear to be responding to the crisis themselves. So the international condemnation and the amplification by the media caused significant ongoing reputational harm to Vale. Earlier, we focused on the issue management failures under the Coombs model, focusing on signal detection and correction, the influence of stakeholders, and the importance of being proactive rather than reactive to avoid or minimise a crisis. Now we're going to look at Vale's broader crisis management systems and response under JACS's model. In this case, we actually start at the post-crisis management step following the 2015 dam failure. Vale failed to properly learn the lessons from this crisis and adapt their approach accordingly. As such, the 2019 failure showed many similar technical issues to that of 2015. The next major failure for Vale was in crisis prevention. The early warning systems and issue scanning was probably the biggest failure in this event, and if these had adequately been addressed, the issues would have never turned into a crisis. Specifically, Vale failed to identify issues of dam instability immediately before the failure. Vale ignored or failed to act on both internal risk reports about the dam, as well as information provided by local stakeholders who identified the dam was leaking just before it failed. While Vale did have an early warning system in place, these alarms failed to activate during the event, likely resulting in further harm and death downstream. Once the crisis commenced, Vale was always going to face major and prolonged problems. But in their management of the initial incident, they made a couple of key missteps. Particularly, they failed to recognise the different context of this crisis to other ones, and that any public or political goodwill the company had was used up following the 2015 disaster. Furthermore, attempts to reframe the issue as an accident or non-fault disaster didn't accord with public sentiments or expectations, and this likely deepened the reputational crisis and the distrust of the company. This crisis and failures within the PPRR framework caused long-lasting reputational and economic damage to Vale. You'll see in a moment some of the consequences Vale faced of this, including criminal prosecutions. This case highlights that if pre-crisis issues were adequately managed, identified and acted upon, the crisis never would have eventuated. So the aftermath for Vale and the executive was significant. The company took a $19 billion stock market hit initially, had $3 billion worth of assets frozen, had to pay $7 billion into a compensation fund, and so far has paid over $250 million in fines to the Brazilian regulator. There's been criminal prosecutions, arrests of mining executive, dam engineers, and the former CEO of Vale is currently on trial for murder because of this event. This highlights the significant organisational, reputational and criminal risks coming with this crisis, all stemming from the lack of action on issues identified in a dam. So what are the lessons learnt for Vale and for crisis communicators more broadly? Firstly, there's a need to honestly evaluate and implement learnings from previous crises. Vale failed to do this from the 2015 crisis, and if they had, the 2019 one may not have happened. There's also failures to properly prioritise and act on issues, and these can create major crises. We saw this with the information Vale had, both internally and externally, about their dam instability, but failed to take action, and ultimately they could have prevented this crisis. There is a preference for crisis management over crisis prevention, and this carries with it a high organisational risk. This case also highlighted the importance of understanding public and stakeholder sentiment and the context when responding to issues. And if you're trying to frame an issue, you need to frame it within that context and within that public sentiment. Despite the significant organisational and reputational costs for Vale, large multinational companies such as them have a path back from these crises. It's long, it's difficult, it's expensive, but unlike small and medium companies, these large multinationals can find a way back and can start to rebuild. Enclosed is a list of references forming the basis of this case study. These have included both the technical theory and some of the social and media responses to the crisis. To conclude this case study, as we look at images from France 24 coverage in the aftermath, I wanted to acknowledge the human, social and environmental costs of this disaster. This case study focused purely on the theory behind crisis management and Vale's role in that crisis. There is a broader environmental, social and human cost to this, which is ongoing and has been devastating for the people involved.